Welcome to the Great Depression, the Hoover years. This is Melinda Cole Klein. The Great Depression lingers in the collective memory of grandparents. It was a tough time for millions of Americans who had lost their life savings or their jobs during this period that lasted about 10 years. The Great Depression came to an end with the rise in the demand for manufactured goods as Europe readied for war. Some believe in the idea that an invisible hand regulates the economy. Man and his laws may impact its direction or manipulate components to increase profits, but neither man nor the government, like the unpredictability of nature, possesses the power to fully control the direction of the economy. Businesses rise and fall depending on a variety of factors. Some entrepreneurial greats, such as Steve Jobs at Apple, invented technologies consumers did not even know they needed. And today, most of us cannot see a world in which we can live without them. While governments attempt to guide the direction of the economy, it truly has a life of its own because no one can fully control or predict consumer trends or spending patterns. However, the secret lies in each of us to unleash entrepreneurship that makes this happen. The 1920s were a time of bathtub gin, speakeasies, and rising stock prices to what many claim to be false highs. Wise investors such as Franklin Delano Roosevelt saw the fall of the stock market coming and liquidated his assets. Millions of others, rich and poor, did not heed the warning by the naysayers that the unbelievable heights to which the stocks had risen would crash. The 1929 Wall Street crash impacted the world economically. It began late in October. The effect dropped the bottom out of the share prices publicly sold on the exchange. In essence, prices collapsed. The crash of '29 followed a long boom decade of rising stock prices. Millions of Americans invested heavily in the stock market. After the event quieted down a bit, the federal government created a Senate committee. This assembly of men studied what factors were responsible for the stock market crash. The facts came as no surprise. It revealed that some unscrupulous bankers had used client deposits to buy stocks. The money, of course, was not theirs to use. However, a large and more pervasive problem practiced was by the general public. First of all, at this time, banks allowed borrowers, rich and poor, to obtain personal loans for stock purchases based on the idea that after a while the stocks would increase in value. This allowed the borrower to pay off the loan for a small percentage fee. The idea was attractive. Does this scheme sound too good to be true? Well, yes, you are correct. Once it was more commonly done, this allowed average folk, from cab drivers to waitresses, to purchase stocks based on their future value. Results? Millions of Americans lost their entire investment if they took advantage of this seemingly foolproof scheme. It was called margin buying. Investors purchased stocks at a fraction of their actual cost. After all, newspapers were filled with average Americans making unbelievable profits by playing the stock market. Secondly, some banks were using depositors' money to invest in the stock market. This would lead to the creation of the Glass-Steagall Act, enacted in 1933, that put in place a series of protections for investors. Today, however, after several revisions, it is known as the Bank Act of 1933. First, it would ensure that the federal government would cover depositors' money per account which it was deposited in a bank. Other factors included disinterest by the middle class to risk their money on the stock market. Historically, land had proved to be the most constant and reliable investment to be had. Next, the federal government had enacted heavy tax policies on wealthy Americans. All the while, business regulations followed. Lastly, the government had reduced the amount of monies collected from foreign imports, making American manufactured goods less competitive domestically and overseas. Combined, this led to disaster. Depending on the time period and political climate, the Act has seen reforms whether or not to allow commercial banking firms to own or run U.S. security firms. Some say that because of the traditional connections that banks have enjoyed with investment firms, this has allowed some banks opportunities to rob customer accounts that has led or will lead to financial crisis. So the debate on how to or to what degree the federal government should limit or regulate American banking is still an ongoing topic today. Only a few months in office, President Hoover was hit with his economic turndown, to which he did not sit idly by. The election cycle of 1928 brought Herbert Hoover to the office of the presidency. Months after assuming his duties, the nation was headed for economic decline. The president tackled it head-on with meetings and conferences. While the president became unpopular with the working class as time went on, he did act aggressively to stop the financial collapse and encourage the American economy. More than any other president before him, Hoover used the power of the federal government and the office of the presidency to deal with this economic crisis. President Hoover called conferences between businessmen and labor leaders to find solutions. He met with mayors and governors, encouraging them to speed up public works projects, which would have created jobs. Hoover supported a tax cut, which Congress enacted in 1929. However, due to the extensive impact of the economic downturn, these initiatives could do little for millions of Americans who would soon find themselves out of work. As mentioned, the middle class as a whole were not interested in the money-making schemes that the working class and poor found attractive. Middle-class professional jobs offer a reliable and steady rate of work because these jobs are typically tied to service or government work, not commerce or consumer trends that fluctuate greatly. While cutbacks were meager for the middle-class professions during the Great Depression, in some areas, such as in healthcare and government jobs, there became a greater demand for qualified workers. Daily life was made more secure for the middle class if they had little debt before the stock market crash, had liquid savings, owned jewels or gold, and generally lived without any unnecessary extravagances. Thus, simple systems such as saving your money, investing in your education to secure a professional job, or business endeavor that will provide a service or necessity, combined with not taking financial risks. For millions of Americans who survived this calamity, this was how they did it unscathed. Those in skilled professions were and are considered depression-proof jobs. Number 1, doctors, nurses, and health professionals. Hospitals and clinic help the sick and dying. Number 2, lawyers, legal assistants, and judges. Our courts and judicial system continues to operate. Number 3, police, fire, emergency, military, and coast guards. Local and national protection and defense continue in good times and bad. Number 4, administrative government positions at the town, county, and state levels. Number 5, teachers. Public and college education continues to educate the masses. And number 6, lastly, we have politicians. Our government, after all, will continue to operate. Middle-class households managed to get through the economic depression by adapting to conditions, spending their money wisely, and avoiding unnecessary purchases. In addition, the elite and middle class tended to limit long-distance travel, but still enjoyed ocean voyages to Europe until late into the 1930s, with growing conflicts with Nazi Germany. Other middle-class spending limitations included perhaps avoiding large purchases such as a new car or a vacation home abroad or domestically. Americans who had speculated on Wall Street until the crash lost every penny they borrowed and spent on stocks. Businesses with similar practices lost credit lines, and consumers lacking ready cash to spend and buy their goods. The economy in America at the time was three-sided: industrial, agricultural, and as a service provider. However, with the drop in stock prices, this left investors without the funds they invested and the amount of money promised to be paid back on their loans. As a result, consumer goods, from shoes to cars, were purchased less often. Once factories cut production to par with consumer shopping trends, they had to lay off workers. In time, businesses would close retail stores and factory doors. Today as well, America has become a consumer-based economy. And when people stop buying things, three groups, the working class, the working poor, and the underemployed, that live paycheck to paycheck, suffer the most. Few people anticipated the stock market crash of 1929, yet there were commentaries on the unbelievable heights it had reached. After the collapse, however, the economy experienced a downward spiral. In 3 years, the median income was 50% of what it had been in 1929. By 1932, as industrial production of manufactured goods had almost ground to a halt, 1 out of 4 working-class Americans, approximately 12.8 million people, were out of work. The Great Depression had complex origins. While wages fell and businesses and banks closed, some businesses increased profits while holding wages down. This pattern reduced customer spending and the manufacture of future goods. This was a time in which working-class Americans could not afford to buy the manufactured goods they produced. The middle class, educated professionals, and the propertied class were the consumers. However, any Americans could buy public stocks, and banks were even lending money with unsecured loans to enable rich and poor to invest in the stock market. The Great Depression was global and hit all industrial countries and non-industrial economies as a result in reduced customer spending. Before the German government stopped paying back on their U.S. loans for World War I war reparations, it is important to note this affected American banks in a rippling effect. As people were evicted from their homes, most Americans continued to look for work. However, hundreds of thousands of Americans took to the open road. One feature of this time included those who traveled from town to town. Some in search of adventure. Across America, the homeless rode the freight trains. Because they were hitchhikers and did not pay passenger fees, it was a dangerous practice. This transient lifestyle was mostly practiced by boys and men, but this trend in search for work was not exclusively male. Oftentimes youths between 12 and 18 took to the trains as well, like others riding on the roof of freight cars or inside unlocked ones. Historians have claimed there were over 250,000 teenagers homeless in America. With the spiraling effects of the Great Depression, families who had become unemployed looked to alternative arrangements to survive. Once city schools closed in certain hard-hit areas, this encouraged boys and girls to leave their families and search for a better life. For youths that were willing to or encouraged by their parents to leave, the quickest way was to board a train and leave town. Keep in mind, this downturn in the economy did not affect all families and their children. However, some youths from the middle class also rode the rails as well, not in search of jobs like others, but for adventure and to see something of America, perhaps away from home for a few months or a season. So the youths that hitchhiked or hoboed on the rails were a mixed group. Mostly, though, were poor. It was dangerous catching a ride on a railroad car. When the cars were sitting in the railroad yards, the trains were patrolled by security personnel. Thus, you had to catch a ride on a car after it left the yard and it was moving. Train guards patrolled yards day and night. They carried rifles, willing to shoot to deter freeloaders from riding the cars. Others carried clubs. But once the slow-moving train was on its way, survivors had commented in history sources it was most exciting. Though it was dangerous and illegal, it was quite a problem for train owners. In 1932, it has been claimed the Southern Pacific Railroad threw off over 500,000 transients, many of them youths. This trend outraged cities and parents. Hollywood chimed in with a film called Wild Boys of the Road. The hope was this film would discourage youths from leaving home and teach them about the dangers of riding the rails. However, to an extent, the film had the opposite effect, because while it taught about the dangers, it encouraged a generation to be adventurous and this would be appealing to some wishing the void of parental or teacher authority. After a while, town residents across the country met trains with rifles. This discouraged the homeless from disembarking in their towns in efforts to look for work. Oftentimes, train riders worked in exchange for a meal, a short-term arrangement, or a bath. More frequent, however, because times were worse in rural parts of America, these illegal train riders found hostility after disembarking. As the United States sunk into the economic depression, the world followed. In May 1931, the leading Austrian bank collapsed. By June, the German financial system was in chaos. In September 1931, England abandoned the gold standard, which led to a decline in international trade and lending. The rest of the industrial world was experiencing a depression. In an effort to help working Americans to better afford their home loans, Hoover asked Congress to make mortgages more readily available. This became the Federal Home Loan Bank Act of 1932. But it helped little. Like other traditional features of government, President Hoover believed firmly in loans, but not free handouts. There was no dignity that could be had from free money. This was not the American way. Modern-day charity to the truly needy is a blessing to those incapable to support themselves in order to live. But this help should be minimal and temporary to encourage inter-family cooperation and employment by capable members of the family. After all, charity begins at home. For millions of unskilled workers who lacked education and housing, these were dire times for those who lived through it. In towns and cities patronized by donors, soup kitchens were set up to help feed the seemingly endless lines of Americans desperate to retain their dignity by finding work. Americans marched in cities demanding access to jobs. Lack of jobs was tied to the reduction in industrial labor demands, but also tied to a larger issue. For those with industrial skills and manufacturing jobs in short supply, this limited the amount of work available. Thus, unless machinists and unskilled laborers could find work, they would remain unemployed. From the 1890s through the 1930s, work was performed more often, especially on farms, by large machines. This trend was consistently affected those who worked long hours through their own labor, only to have this employment replaced by fast-moving machines. Across America, the implementation of machines demanded a new generation of workers, along with adaptability of Americans to learn new work skills. For millions, their choice in livelihoods held little job security, while resisting education compounded the issue. Soon after the Wall Street crash of 1929, thousands of banks closed their doors, leaving depositors little recourse to retrieve their savings. Hoover promoted the idea of a centralized banking system, which would have been regulated and controlled by the government. This idea stood in direct opposition to the democratic solution that resulted in FDIC in the Bank Act of 1933. This democratic solution led the government to hold money in reserve to protect depositors' funds against corporate institutions, while banks carried on their activities as they saw fit. If they failed, the government, not the bank executives, would bail out investors. By 1933, over 4,000 American banks had closed their doors. A run on a bank could mean sudden ruin. Small banks could not withstand the demands by investors with requests to withdraw all their funds from savings accounts. In response, they often closed their doors. There are several reasons why certain banks did not have cash payouts for customers. Here are three to consider. First, and most importantly, banks are in the business of lending money for a fee. This fee is typically paid in upfront costs and interest paid, while the loan is in repayment. This takes time. Depositors' monies are not held in a vault in the bank, but are loaned out and paid back over long periods of time through secured or unsecured loans. If members stop paying back their loans and depositors demand funds, combined with other factors, this could lead to bank failures. Secondly, after the war, banks had eagerly lent millions of average Americans money for housing construction and unsecured loans for stock purchases. When average Americans lost their jobs, they defaulted on their loans. While bank monies could be tied up in property for years, those banks making unsecured loans were most likely to be ruined following the Wall Street crash. And thirdly, you have to keep in mind that some bank executives use depositors' money to buy stocks based on the expectation of future stock values. If this money was not returned to the bank prior to the '29 crash, the gig was up and the bank was in trouble due to mismanagement of its funds. The Bonus March is remembered in American history as an unfortunate event. It ended in violence for some veterans that refused to follow the advice of their president and leave the Capitol. This began as a peaceful demonstration. It is tied to the activities of about 20,000 World War I veterans, plus an equal number of civilians, during the spring and summer months of 1932. Congress was expected to vote whether or not U.S. veterans would receive an early payout of their promised 1945 bonus granted under the Adjusted Service Certificate Law of 1924. Unfortunately for President Hoover, violence resulted, and this would tarnish the already low popularity working-class Americans held for their president. While protesters awaited early payouts, as surely Congress would pass the requested change, the results angered resistors. While the House of Representatives passed the motion, it was rejected by the Senate. Veterans would have to wait for their money until 1945. After the bill was defeated, the president encouraged the veterans to return home. For those who could not afford the transportation costs, the government offered bus and railroad costs to be paid on their behalf. Thousands left after the president had suggested. Some did not. In time, police efforts began to physically remove resistors from their temporary camps set up on federal open lands in Washington, D.C. But in the end, a few resistors were shot. U.S. World War I veterans. Newspapers quickly drove up the drama of this tragedy while the government had to react to control the accelerating situation better than local police had done. The president resorted to calling in the military to quell veteran resistors. This effort was led by George S. Patton and Douglas MacArthur, both career Army officers. Later, they would earn their place in history during World War II. For the resisting Bonus March veterans, this group of about 1,000 men, women, and children were exposed to tear gas while strong-armed by federal troops. 2 were killed and hundreds were injured. While Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover to run for re-election in 1932, working-class Americans voted for a Democrat, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, governor of New York. This would bring a progressive reformer back into the White House. And with a Democratic majority in Congress, President Roosevelt would succeed in instituting social reforms that offered taxpayer money safety nets for Americans in need. As governor of New York, Roosevelt had promoted cheaper utility, protection against the effects of erosion and deforestation, along with supporting old age pensions. In his run for the office of the presidency, however, the governor did not specifically have a master plan for Americans in 1932. In general addresses, he promised Americans a New Deal. For millions of unemployed Americans, his promises were enough for them. In the election cycle of 1932, the incumbent Herbert Hoover ran against New York's popular governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Like in the election of 2012, in 1932 the main issue was that of jobs and the national economy. As compared with the election cycle of 1928, people who had traditionally not voted, meaning the poor and the working class, came to the polls and voted for Roosevelt in record numbers. Historians claim triple the normal numbers of working class, unemployed, and poor voted than they had done during the 1920s. The 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, would be a one-term president as his economic solutions did not lead to recovery, and in the election of 1932, the poor and unemployed voted in record numbers for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promised them a New Deal.